And just like that, the god took away my brother. Some kind of seal was cast upon me, and I lost my power. So whilst we used to cross world after world, we are now trapped here. How many years ago was it? I don't know. But I intend to find out. After I awoke, I was all alone. Right up until I met you 2 months ago.
Yeah, Paimon really owes you for that. Otherwise, Paimon likely would have drowned. So Paimon will do her best to be a great guide.
What is Genshin Impact, you might ask? Well, Genshin Impact is a free-to-play action RPG developed and published by the company MiHoYo in the back half of 2020. The game is available for many different platforms such as PC, Xbox, PlayStation, and you can even play it mobile. We believe Genshin Impact is able to produce top-tier world building and game feel for players through various different systems in the game. Systems such as the story, characters, the combat, and the overworld map. In this video, we will be giving commentary on how the game is able to achieve a nice game feel and world building. So now, let's get on with the story. But first, what is world building? World building is defined as the process of developing a detailed and plausible fictional world for a novel or story, especially in science fiction, fantasy, and video games. Thanks dictionary.com. So basically, world building is the process of bringing life to a fictional world. Kinda like childbirth. But anyways, now let's get on to the story. Genshin Impact takes place in the fantasy world of Teyvat, which is home to 7 distinct nations, each of which is tied to an element and ruled by a god associated with it. The story follows a twin, referred to as the Traveler, who has traveled across many worlds with their twin, but has become separated from them by an unknown god in Teyvat. The Traveler, living up to their name, travels across Teyvat in search of their lost sibling, with the companion, Paimon, and becomes involved in the affairs of other nations, gods, and the world. When you first start the game, you are immediately thrown into the world of Teyvat. Throughout your adventure, you are given various story quests as you level up and learn more about the world. The first storyline takes place in the region of Mondstadt, which is associated with the Anemo Archon, Venti. Here, you meet up with the faction called the Knights of Favonius, and you help them maintain peace by defeating the Wind Dragon, Stormkeeper. What the story quests do a great job with is exploring the lore of the world. For a lot of the main storyline, the game includes these short cutscenes that illustrate stories and tales from the fictional world. Here's one.
In old Mondstadt transpired the story to be told, where a tyrant ruled. I met a boy not that old. The lyre he played, and for a song he sought. But storm walls blocked blue sky, he was sincerely distraught. I do so wish to see the birds in flight, said he, his strong eyes filling with light. But his voice was lost in the howling wind's churn, for the whirlwind takes and gives not in return. The true sky and songs that cageless soar, were they not wishes worth fighting for? So the boy turned, extending his hand. Let us cast down the tyrant and his walls from this land. The young boy raised then the flag of revolt, and I threw myself into freedom's tumult. Victorious were we who fought to be free. Gods fell, winds whipped, nations shook violently. In the smoke, a despot met his doom, and we watched as his great tower fell none too soon. Mondstadt began anew, the story passed down, and since then never has another worn its crown.
So, you may be asking, why is this an example of great world building? Well, it's great because it actively demonstrates the richness of this fantasy world's lore and stories that normally wouldn't be common knowledge since these stories take place in the past, and you, the player, weren't around to witness it. Another great part of the storytelling is that they drop little crumbs of knowledge throughout the storyline that leave players curious about what is to come. Sorry, but I'm going to use Venti as an example again. When you first meet him, he just comes across as another lowly bard, but as you progress, you acquire more and more knowledge about him, and come to the conclusion that he is a literal god. This is what you call expectation subversion, which is a great storytelling device in our opinion. So, overall, we believe that the story plays a pivotal role in Genshin Impact's great world building. Another aspect of the story that helps the game in terms of world building is the incorporation of you, the player. In a paper about game feel, done by the School of Computer Science at the University of Lincoln, the authors talk about the concept of dimensions of experience, which is quite literally the dimensions of experience that can emerge through gameplay. One of the key parts to this concept is meaningful actions, which calls for the player's actions to be meaningful to the world of the game. Genshin Impact does a great job at executing this by making the player the key component in a lot of the story. For instance, you are the one to defeat the big bad wind dragon, and you are the one who saves Liyue Harbor from annihilation. And I think that making the player feel like they've protected the world is an important aspect of game feel and world building. Now, I'll throw it to Don as he talks about the world, soundtrack, and the characters of Genshin Impact.
Welcome to Teyvat, a fantasy world where the 7 elements flow and converge. Teyvat is comprised of 7 major nations. Each nation corresponds with a specific element. The first nation, Mondstadt, is correlated with the Anemo element, or wind. Liyue corresponds with the Geo element. Inazuma corresponds with the Electro element. Sumeru corresponds with the Dendro or Earth element. Fontaine corresponds with the Hydro element. Natlan corresponds to the Pyro or Fire element. And the last nation, Shesnaya, corresponds with the Cryo or Ice element. Currently, there are only 2 nations in the current build of Genshin Impact. Mondstadt, the City of Freedom that lies northeast of Teyvat, and Liyue, the bountiful harbor that lies east of Teyvat. This is the entirety of the current map. This line broadly separates Mondstadt from Liyue. Mondstadt is heavily inspired by German architecture, while Liyue is heavily inspired by Chinese architecture. German influence is very easily seen in Mondstadt. We can see inspiration by half-timbered houses, the medieval buildings and the walls that surround them, and even the cobblestone streets that we walk on. All trace back to German roots. The use of influences in the real world heavily increases the amount of game feel in Genshin Impact. Knowing that there are different cultures around the world of Teyvat makes the world feel more lived in and believable, and that is very important in developing the world. The last major influence is the Church of Favonius Cathedral, which is heavily inspired by the Cologne Cathedral in Germany.
I'll catch up.
Finally, as perhaps a testament to its German influences, Mondstadt has wide open green fields, not too dissimilar to ones in Germany, with trees surrounding those green fields and mountains as high as the sky. Let's head over to Liyue. As I stated before, Liyue is heavily based in Chinese culture. In fact, right now, there's a Lunar New Year event happening in the game. Lunar New Year is best seen at night, so let's change that right now. The lanterns that adorn the sky of Liyue are part of a lantern rite, which is very similar to the Lantern Festival seen every year in China for Lunar New Year. As we head into the city, we can see more influences from China pop up everywhere. For example, the gate in front of us that leads us to the main city of Liwei Harbor is called a Pai Feng, which is traditionally seen in Chinese architecture. Alongside that are the colors of red and gold, traditionally used in Chinese culture as well. As we cross the bridge and head into the city, we run into the night market. Night markets or night bazaars are street markets most commonly found in East and Southeast Asia. They operate at night and are generally dedicated to more leisurely strolling, shopping, and eating. They are typically open-air markets like this one and are distinctively very important to Asian culture. Going up these steps, we see a building in front of us, which is heavily based on a Chinese pedagogue. We also see much more of the colors of red and gold again, and more street vendors as we walk down the street.
Dodoko? Dodoko, where are you?
Another factor that makes Genshin Impact's world building and overall game feel so great is the characters' design and how those same characters fit into the world of Teyvat. Character design is a crucial part of game feel. Characters must be captivating in their art direction, while also conveying to the player that those same characters should belong in that world, fitting into the world while standing out, with distinct personalities and gameplay traits. These three factors heavily influence the characters in Genshin Impact, and in turn, create a more cohesive world. There are currently 29 different playable characters in Genshin Impact, not including your Traveler main character that you get at the start of the game. 16 of these characters hail from the city of Mondstadt, while 12 of the other characters hail from Liwei Harbor. Here are the 16 characters that hail from Mondstadt. First we have Jean, Amber, Lisa, Kea, Barbara, D-Luke, Razor, Venti, Klee, Bennett, Noelle, Vishal, and Sucrose, Mona, Diona, and Albedo. Hailing from Liwei Harbor, we have Xiao, Beidou, Ningguang, Shangling, Xingqiu, Chongyun, Qi, Keqing, Zhongli, Xinyan, Ganyu, and Hu Tao. I'll only be using examples for some characters, as if I were to use a showcase for every character, this video would be very, very long. Here, we have two characters that come from Liwei, Keqing on the left and Ningguang on the right. Each playable character has a certain element to which they can wield, and is shown with their overall art style, as well as a small gem on their person called a vision. Keqing's vision is Electro, while Ningguang's is Geo. These two are part of the Liwei Qixing, which are business leaders who govern Liwei. Ningguang is responsible for laws and governance, and Keqing is responsible for construction and city planning. Keqing and Ningguang both have uniforms based off of traditional Chinese dresses. Both of them have heavy influences from a Qi Pao. Keqing also has heavy influence from a shortened Hanfu, a different Chinese dress. Keqing's idol animation also tells a lot about her character. As she is the city planner, she decides to look at a map of Liwei Harbor. Here, from her back, we can also see the vision that adorns her back. Music is one of the only pieces of media that can not only work well on its own, but further enhance other pieces of media along with it. This is because most other popular media is consumed visually, like movies, TV shows, video games, or even books. Music, however, is of course consumed audibly. Music has the power to create emotion without even showing us anything. Therefore, music can have a big effect on game feel. Soundtracks in video games have the purpose of reinforcing a mood or tone that the game is trying to portray in gameplay. Genshin Impact's soundtrack is really, really good. The soundtrack does its job in reference to game feel because it changes to whatever situation you're currently in. It matches the tone of the game, which the game is trying to portray. The soundtrack was all recorded by the Shanghai Symphony Orchestra. The song you're listening to right now within the soundtrack is the music for Kingse Village, a small farming town in Liyue. Something to know about Kingse Village is that it's relatively small. It's also very quiet, as not many people live there, and only the farmers that work the fields tend to stay around within the game. Just simply looking at Kingse Village within the game, you could probably come to that same conclusion. However, with a soundtrack, it further progresses the idea that Kingse Village is a small town. So, in order to reflect the overall mood of Kingse Village, the soundtrack uses string instruments to play a more reserved tone compared to other soundtracks within Genshin Impact. This is what Kingse Village looks like in the daytime. Owl is just one example from Kingse Village. The other city in Liyue is Liyue Harbor, and since it's a much busier city than Kingse Village, the music also reflects that. Here in Liyue Harbor, we can already see that there's a much higher density of people compared to Kingse Village. There are also many shops and small food stands surrounding the streets of the harbor. The bustling nature of Liyue Harbor is then reflected in the soundtrack, with a much higher tempo compared to other songs. There are even more songs in the soundtrack that contrast Liyue Harbor. This location is the snowy mountainside of Dragonspine. This is the windy city of Mondstadt that I covered in my first section. And this is where I've been the whole time, at Stormterror's Lair, one of the world bosses of Genshin Impact. The music of Genshin Impact really tie everything together and enhance the amount of game feel that is presented. The last thing I want to cover is the battle music, which will quickly transition into Dylan's part on gameplay and combat.
Just like with the exploration, the combat in Genshin Impact is more intricate than what it initially appears. While you can defeat the weakest enemies simply by mashing the attack button and hitting them a few times, you won't be able to do the same for the tougher enemies. Even a few moments into the game, you'll run into enemies that require you to diversify your strategies and employ different methods to defeat them. Let's examine some of the basic aspects of the combat in this game. There are several different types of weapon in the game, with characters being able to equip just one of these. Some of these weapon types include swords, bows, catalysts, and claymores, while the power and strength will depend on the base attack of the specific weapon, which can be upgraded. Every weapon has its own attack style and common elements, regardless of the character that's using it. Since these elements have no formal name in-game, we decided to call them range, weight, and speed, and they involve the following. Range. The expected attack range of the weapon, with catalysts and bows being among the ones with the longest reach, and claymores, spears, and swords being the melee variants. Weight. Some weapons, like claymores, are heavier than others and are great for specific purposes like breaking ores or ripping through enemies' geo shields in a few swings. Speed. Some weapons are inherently faster than others when attacking, though this also is highly dependent on the character that's wielding them. Once again, these are not any formal terms or attributes, so you won't find them anywhere in-game. Regardless, these properties are still things you should consider when it comes to choosing the characters in your formation. You should always have a mix of fast weapons, a bow character for aim shots, and at least one claymore user that can easily harvest ore from veins and pop geo shields. Character-specific traits. Every weapon is unique and shares different properties. However, in the hands of different heroes, even the same type of weapon can act very differently from the West. For instance, while both Lisa and Barbara both use catalysts, they have different speeds in both their basic attacks as well as special skills. It's important to learn how each character functions, especially when it comes to their special skills, since these can give you the edge in combat by applying different debuffs and elemental effects to the enemy. Elemental combos. Speaking of which, this is hands down one of the best features of the combat in Genshin Impact. The way in which the elemental effects work and how they interact with each other is genius and lends itself perfectly to the party systems, and you can freely swap between 4 characters at all times to apply different elemental effects that results in powerful combos, which can whittle down even the toughest of enemies. There are 7 different element types in Genshin Impact: Anemo, Geo, Electro, Dendro, Hydro, Pyro, Cryo. These elemental types are present in many parts of the world. For instance, stepping in a body of water will apply the Hydro effect, while walking through fire will apply the Pyro effect, and so on. Moreover, while some elemental effects are benign, others can cause detrimental status effects for their duration. The elements can trigger status effects are the following. Pyro. The target will burn for a few seconds, causing minor damage every second for a short duration. Cryo. The target's movement speed is reduced for a short duration. Geo. The target gains the crystallization status, reducing the elemental damage they inflict for all except the Geo element. A crystallized character can also pick up elemental energy shards to gain a shield that blocks all damage until it breaks. This shield is stronger against the element of the corresponding elemental shard. Hydro. The target becomes wet and primed for further elemental reactions. Electro. The target becomes electrified and primed for further elemental reactions. Similarly, all elemental effects can be combined with others to create different elemental reactions. Even elements that don't inflict status effects can be used for detonating certain reactions. The existing elemental reactions include the following. Overloaded. Pyro plus Electro. Does pyro damage in an AoE around the target. Electrocharged. Hydro plus Electro. Electrifies the enemy, causing damage over time that arcs to other enemies that are afflicted with the wet status. Superconductor. Cryo plus Electro. Does cryo damage in an AoE around the target. Swirl. Anemo plus Pyro / Cryo / Hydro / Electro. The wind attack spreads the target's status effect to all nearby enemies. Burning. Dendro plus Pyro. Sets the target on fire, dealing major damage over time. Frozen. Hydro plus Cryo. Freezes the target, restricting their movement and making them vulnerable to shattering. Shattered. Frozen target plus heavy attack. When a frozen target is attacked with a shattering blow via a heavy attack, it shatters and suffers additional physical damage. Melt. Cryo plus Cryo. The target melts and loses both elemental effects, suffering additional damage from the attack that triggered the reaction. Vaporize. Pyro plus Hydro. The target vaporizes and loses both elemental effects, suffering additional damage from the attack that triggered the reaction. Dealing with special enemies. It's important to note that some of these elemental interactions are basically mandatory in some cases, especially since some enemies can take absurdly long to beat you unless you exploit their elemental vulnerabilities. Some of the enemies that require special elemental effects include the hilly churls with shields, which become much easier if you burn their dendro shields with pyro attacks, or the geoslimes, which lose their strong defenses if you shatter them with a heavy attack, among others. In this sense, it's always worth it to keep at least one character of every element leveled up in case you need to swap them into combat. By learning about the different elemental combos and their effects, as well as the properties of every weapon type, you can defeat the strongest enemies in Genshin Impact, even those that are a few levels above your own.
So, in conclusion, we believe that through the amazing storytelling, the expansive world, the detailed character design, the bombastic soundtrack, and the intricacies of the combat system, Genshin Impact is able to create unrivaled game feel.